Hold on just a second and you can start talking. Hey, thanks for coming, everybody. We've got this session, part of the health track of sessions, but in this case, dealing with animal health. And, you know, we all talk a lot about the linkages between animal and human health and various initiatives. So thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. We're going to start with Lee Schultz from Iowa State University, who we have online. These are his slides already queued up. He's got them ready to go. So Lee, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Thank you for folks for coming to the session. I come to you from beautiful Ames, Iowa. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some ongoing research with Jiwan Lee, looking at different intervention measures for African swine fever. As you think about questions, comments, you can direct all the criticism to me, give all the credit to Jiwan. Jiwan's a fresh PhD graduate here at Iowa State, is going to be going to the Bank of Korea here shortly. Now, you may ask why do we concerned about consumer responses here? A lot of the work we've done is looking at producer responses. But when you look at consumer concerns about the safety of pork, National Pork Board, they did a survey back in spring of 2018 that asked consumers, even after we gave them some information that this is a disease in pigs, not humans, and not a public health concern, even after all that information, more than half of the consumers said they'd stop eating pork if ASF was found here in the U.S. We did a survey in spring of 2020, and that's where a lot of our research will be coming out of, that asked a similar question, and these are of pork consumers, and 46% of those respondents said they would not eat pork if we did have ASF here in the United States. So even as we've learned more about the disease, as it's become more familiar to folks over that 2-year period, we're still seeing those responses. Now, what is ASF? Again, it's a highly contagious disease in both domestic and wild swine. It is one of the tier 1 diseases. It has never occurred here in the United States. CSF, which is one of the other tier 1 diseases, we eradicated that in 1978, and FMD in 1929. So it's been some time since we've dealt with any of these tier 1 diseases in the United States, and ASF, we've never dealt with it. Now, again, to highlight, this is not a human health threat or a food safety concern, but it is notifiable to the World Animal Health Organization because of its high socioeconomic impact, and there's a lot of players involved, namely trade, and so that's why it is a reportable disease. It would devastate really the whole pork supply chain and everyone involved in it. One of my colleagues here at Iowa State, a few of my colleagues did a study back in 2020. They're using 2019 data that showed if we had an outbreak of ASF here, we're looking at prices really cutting in half, depending on the scenario, revenue losses of 15 to 50 billion, over 100,000 jobs lost, and so on and so forth. And you could argue that impact would be even greater today as the economic contribution of the pork industry is even greater, and a lot of players in the industry. So understanding that all the interaction both upstream and downstream would be impacted, and that would contribute to those billions and billions of losses had we get an outbreak. Now, there's been significant investment into ASF specifically. That was part of a package of investments that USDA made here a little over a year ago. And what was a bit unprecedented about this, and a former APHIS administrator noted that, is, this is a single disease, and we're getting all the funds up front before we get the disease. So the 500 million that USDA is investing in this, again, is a notable portion, even though it's only a part of that $3 billion investment that they're making. Now, why are we so concerned about this? Well, the global epi spread has changed dramatically, and there's a concern now that it's spreading in disease-free regions and possibly including the United States. So we kind of follow the trajectory here. We did get a reoccurrence in 2007 in Europe and Georgia and Armenia. Then 2018 was the big outbreak in China, and it's continued to spread in Asia. In 2021 was the first time in 40 years it's been in the Western Hemisphere, in Haiti and Dominican Republic. Then in 2022, we had a wild boar in Italy get it. So it continues to spread in not only endemic regions of Africa, but now as we've seen it in Europe and Asia as well. Now, as we look at, experiences of others, certainly the countries that have had outbreaks have reported impacts on consumption, and some have noted impacts on demand. Remember, as economists, we're going to measure demand a little bit differently. So I think, some of these notes of reduced consumption are not necessarily demand impact. You're just seeing higher prices, availability of that product. And so, I don't know if a lot of these studies have really teased out the true demand impact, but also these reports have shown that, how this information is reported is certainly impacting consumers, and the lack of a vaccine is certainly impacting consumers, or it's what's used in the media. There was a study by Phil Parlberg back in 2002, and this was with FND, that showed just a 7% reduction in U.S. consumption if we had an FND outbreak would lead to much larger natural welfare losses. And so that's why we kids care about kind of the consumer impact here. And mostly we care about keeping it out and preventing it, right? And so there's the only real currently available measure is enhanced biosecurity. And this would be practices above and beyond what farms are typically doing. Now, they are doing some of these practices, but some of these are additional practices that would help mitigate not only endemic diseases or diseases we have here already, but these additional diseases. And they've come out as part of the Secure Pork Supply Plan, and now we also have this pilot program, the U.S. Swine Health Improvement, or U.S. SHIP, that would help certify some of these biosecurity practices. There is no a treatment for ASF. There's no vaccine for it. Part of the challenge, it's a very large, complex virus. It's very hardy and extremely stable in the environment. Now, there's been a lot of R&D towards getting a vaccine, because as I've shown, there's been a lot of spread of the disease and impact of the disease. In January 2020, there was a story about candidates were progressing towards commercialization, but it's only focusing on the latest strain. Now, we've had the April 2022 announcement that a candidate passed the safety test, so we're closer to that commercial availability. And then on June 1, there was another announcement that there is a commercially viable vaccine. It was developed in Vietnam. It's a collaboration of USDA, ARS, and a Vietnamese company. And so, but this is really only to the current Asian strain. And it's more to remember that even if we had a commercially viable vaccine, not all developed pig countries would use it, because there is still trade implications if you're ASF free with vaccination versus ASF free without vaccination. And we haven't really, there's been a real challenge to get a universally developed vaccine for all the strains. And even if we did have a vaccine, we're going to have approval from animal health officials within each of those countries before it would be used. And finally, gene editing. We've seen progress towards this in the laboratory to make precise genetic changes to pig physiology. Importantly, there's no gene-edited pigs currently entering the food supply. There's been a lot of debate about regulatory framework, if it's oversight by FDA or USDA or a combination of the two. Where there has been the most progress is towards PRRS virus-resistant pigs. And so PRRS is porcine reproductive respiratory syndrome virus. This is the most economically important disease in North America, Europe, Asia. It's over $1 billion every year, impact to the industry. Vaccines have failed for this, and a lot of the pig genetic companies, they note that they're in the investigative stage here with this technology. This would certainly enlarge the toolbox for ASF, but importantly here, and this is a reference from beef, but it's adoption of any technology really relies on consumer social acceptance as much as the efficacy or the management practice itself. A good friend and colleague, Glenn Tonser, I've seen him reference this a lot. I'm not a tweeter myself, but this is very germane to this discussion, right? It's that science tells us what we can do, and we're progressing towards those vaccines and gene editing, but society certainly tells us what we should do. And so that's really the motivation for some of our work here. We did a survey, partner with the Center for Survey Statistics and Methodology here at Iowa State, and Dynata, who is an international marketing company, used their panel. We did this survey during the spring of 2020. Balanced the survey relative to census demographics. We made sure it was people that ate pork. And there was, importantly, 3 versions of this survey. So as part of Jiwan's dissertation research, this was one of the chapters, and there was 3 experiments within this survey. So here are some general characteristics of our respondents. Eating pork more than once a week, about 56%. They eat pork once a week at home or away from home, about 21% or so, and you can see how the rest of that's balanced there. So now when we ask those consumers, how aware of African swine fever were they? This is just a Likert scale. About 16% were moderately aware or very aware. When we asked about their risk perception, so here it's, how likely do you think there will be an outbreak of ASF in the US in the next 10 years? So we took the 50% and I don't know, and then on both sides of that is the high likelihood, so the very likely, and then the low ASF outbreak risk is the unlikely and very unlikely. So you can see it's about a 25% on both of those. Now, when you think about African swine fever, really any diseases in general, there is, potential to threaten pig health as well as animal welfare. Here are some of the symptoms of ASF. Now, there's been some research that shows that consumers less likely to recognize a relationship between animal welfare and disease prevention. But there's also been some research too that showed that consumers who prioritize animal welfare may be willing to accept gene editing if you're emphasizing that it can improve animal welfare through that technology. Now, importantly, we didn't emphasize that in the survey, but through one of the questions in the survey, we can measure that. So we asked consumers how important are the following factors when you buy pork. About 50% of them said they take animal welfare into consideration, or it's important or very important. One of the other things we looked at in the survey, we used this abbreviated version of the food technology neophobia scale. So it's 9 questions where we gauge their neophobia to food technology. We take those 9 items and we find one factor through a principal component analysis. It gives us pretty good reliability. We take the mean, above the mean, those are neophobic. So that's about 41% of the respondents. Non-neophobic was below that mean. And so create a variable there. And then we had a best worst discrete choice experiment in here. It gives us not only the best, but we get the worst and well as the second best. That gives us some statistical efficiency and power. Also, in reality, that first best might not be available, right? When we think about the vaccination or gene editing. So it allows us to kind of match that, reality versus what that preference information would be. And so our attributes were enhanced biosecurity, vaccination, and gene editing. We had 4 price levels. The status quo would be conventional with the price of $3.35. That's what the prevailing price is when we looked at pork chops on various reports at the time. And then we also gave them an opt-out option. So we gave descriptions of each of those intervention measures. I'm not going to show those for a matter of time, but then they went and took the experiment. So I'm going to give you a taste of the results here shortly. Kind of lazy here. I just put up the tables. Usually I don't like to do that, but thought I'd just highlight the general results here. So first, when we just looked at the model of just looking at the attributes themselves, there you show there's some preference for enhanced biosecurity and vaccination. But when we also interact those attributes with consumer characteristics, you see that we lose statistical significance on those attributes. You know, that could suggest that the preference for those attributes is largely explained by the consumer characteristics themselves. What are some of those consumer characteristics? Well, as you see, so younger folks with higher education prefer gene editing. People that reside in the western part of the United States versus the Midwest prefer gene editing. As you look at pork, when you consume pork at home more than once a week, there's a preference for enhanced biosecurity. And then when you get in, and then looking at, you know, when you have a preference for animal welfare, you think that's important or very important for what when you're buying pork. You know, there's a greater probability that you're choosing enhanced biosecurity. You know, that one's interesting. There is some research out of the EU that says, you know, animal welfare, you care about proactive practices. You could argue that, you know, enhanced biosecurity is proactive. Plus, it's also dealing with other potential diseases. So not just targeting at African swine fever, but also looking at some of those other endemic diseases that a farm may have or a region may have. If you're seeing a higher subjective knowledge of ASF, there's a higher preference for gene editing. There you could argue, you know, if you know more about ASF and how bad of a disease it is, you're willing to or have a preference for gene editing because of the possible benefits that could accrue from that. Higher perceived risk of an outbreak here in the US, as you would expect, all measures, you prefer them as opposed to the conventional. And then neophobic, there, as you would expect, less likely to choose gene editing, more likely to choose conventional under that scenario. Here being some of those estimated willingness to pays, you know, as you look at neophobic there, it's about $1.20 per pound discount. You know, here's where I think the potential is, and you know, some of the work that we're going to look at is, you know, what are those discounts potentially required? And so here we've kind of graphed out looking at different purchase rates based on prices. So I think this would help you kind of graph out, you know, where you could best position those products or what you would need effectively for a discount before you get greater purchases of those products. You know, I think this has potential extensions as we look at PRRS resistant pigs and gene editing there. The potential to, you know, reduce significant inefficiencies on farms because of PRRS, and you know, the potential there, it would also have to match up with consumer preferences too, and potentially discount for that pork. Now, you know, importantly, there isn't really a market for enhanced biosecurity. G1 did some work earlier that was published in the Journal of Agribusiness that said producers would be willing to pay about 58 cents per pig per year for tier 1 disease risk mitigation. Now, when you look at what consumers were willing to pay, you know, there was some notable willingness to pay potentially based on those consumer characteristics. But there's really no market for that currently. Now, when I look at the swine contract library as it relates to biosecurity, you know, there is some language in there, but it's just generally that, you know, we're going to maintain biosecurity on these farms. We're going to focus on preventative methods such as vaccination and biosecurity are recommended, but there has nothing to do with enhanced biosecurity or some of these programs that are being developed like Secure Pork Supply or US Ship. The rest of the biosecurity really has to do with visits, inspections on the farm, and maintaining that biosecurity. When I looked at, you know, what programs are currently available for pigs and pork, you're looking at non-carcass merit premiums that vary from animal welfare to antibiotic free, to process verified program where some of those could be for enhanced biosecurity. but those programs really are vast, and there's a lot of those programs potentially available, and the premium there is significant across that. So that's the graph on your left there, where some of those premiums probably for a bundle of characteristics are over $30 per hundredweight. That's roughly $60 per pig, all the way down to about nothing, and the weighted average is only about $5 per hundredweight or $10 per pig. When you look at the volume of this pork that's traded in the marketplace, you're looking at about 6% of the total volume that has some of these non-carcass merit premium traits. So it's a relatively small part of the volume that's traded out there. But when you think about biosecurity, you know, there's a huge public good to that, and a huge need to have, you know, overall kind of general or over total participation in a program like that. So I'll wrap up with that, and I'll be happy to take any questions now or at the end of the session.
Any questions for Lee? Yes, please.
Lee, can you hear me? Can you hear her, Lee?
I cannot.
Hold on.
She's gonna come ask.
All right.
Hey Lee, this is Amber from Kansas State. I was just wondering, with any of the work you've done with ASF, does the feral hog population in the US ever come up? And is there a concern with what would happen if it entered the feral hog population in the US? Are we ready for that? And what would that do to us?
Certainly. So that's a good question, Amber. You know, the feral hog population certainly exists in the United States. It's very regional in nature. They would say that we don't have any feral hogs here in Iowa, whereas, you know, the southern part of the U.S. is where the feral hog population is. So, you know, part of it is, you know, most of the density of pigs here in Iowa, we have a third of the pigs, right? So the feral hogs maybe not be where the largest density of those pigs are. They certainly remain a risk to it. You know, I would say that we have different practices than say in Europe to deal with the feral hog population. You know, it's very protected in Europe. You think about Germany as part of the cultural hunting, you know, a lot less here. And so I think, you know, we have kind of curbed that population, but it certainly, you know, does remain a risk. You know, I think when you think about, I'm just trying to go, this slide right here, I don't know if you can see it. Their enhanced biosecurity in the South, interestingly, you know, there is a, you know, higher willingness to pay or more preference for that enhanced biosecurity. You know, that's certainly interesting from the case that consumer or producers would say that too, right? Because of the need, because of the feral hog population there. So, no, I would summarize with, I think that remains a risk, but I think most of the attention has certainly been on other routes of incursion into the domestic population.
Anybody else? Good question. Yes, we got one more here, Lee. Hold on just a second.
Hi, this is Ashley Hungerford from the Office of Management and Budget. And to my knowledge, USDA hasn't announced how they'll exactly allocate that 500 million announced last year. If you had your way, what would be the best and what would be the worst way to spend that 500 million, since in the grand scheme of things, it's a fairly small amount of money? Thank you very much.
Yep. Well, good question, Ashley. You know, I think some of the previous work that we've done, you know, would say that, you know, you should potentially, you know, piggyback those programs off of other programs. So, you know, for example, you know, you should have a biosecurity plan in place. And if so, you know, you would be first in line for indemnification if it was available, right? And so I think programs like that, where you incentivize producers to adopt the currently available practices are probably your biggest bang for your buck. I think a lot of these biosecurity practices are very much complementary So if you could maybe cost share on some of those practices for producers, if you could get them to do a critical threshold, and I don't know what that threshold is, I think through some of the research we did, we could help identify that. You would be able to, I think, get more full participation into some of these programs like Secure Pork Supply and US Ship. So, I think there's some potential there from some policy to be able to really incentivize increased adoption of biosecurity for producers that makes us, more resilient to, possible outbreaks if they were to occur.
Great. Any other question for Lee? We got one more, Lee. You're a popular guy, popular topic. I'm afraid those feral hogs are immune to all those diseases, though. Go ahead.
Hi, Lee. My name's also Ashley, but I was wondering, when you're talking about biosecurity and incentivizing uptake, how do you see diagnostic testing for ASF fitting into that? Or do you, I guess, would also be the question, if there's any testing for ASF and how that might look.
Yeah, so, I certainly need to admit, I'm not a veterinarian, and the veterinarians would probably say I spend too much time trying to answer some of their questions or be involved in some of their work. I think certainly when you look at the Secure Pork Supply and the US Ship plan, biosecurity is only one component of this program for producers, veterinarians, and really all stakeholders throughout. So, what I focus on here is biosecurity, but diagnostic testing, traceability, all of that is very much, part of that. My understanding with some of the ASF testing, it becomes very difficult to get the size you need to have the power of the test. And so I think there is some of the challenge that, being able to identify the disease, where is the biggest bang for your buck on some of that, where I've seen a lot of the attention, at least some of the momentum from the academia and some of the animal health folks is, getting some of these programs up and going. I think we've seen some big success stories, right? When you think about high-path avian influenza and their national health improvement plan for the avians has been very successful in being able to regionalize some of those impacts and still maintain some of those trade barriers. Certainly testing is part of that, and the blanket approach that's taken into place. So, I would contend that, there's a lot of ways we could spend that money, and a lot of ways that a lot of different components fit into, making us more secure in our supplies of pork.
Great. Thanks, Lee. I think that was our last question. That's a good set of questions.
I'll stop sharing here, Dave, and then I'll stay on and take questions later if we have them.
Hey, that sounds great. Thanks, Lee.
Hey, Tom, were you able to get that link to work?
I am set. Thank you very much.
Perfect. We gotta share your screen so they can see it.
That would help.
First off, we're gonna get rid of that. Your screen. That's your scenes. All right, y'all on Zoom, can you see that?
Yes.
Perfect.
Thanks for your help, Tori.
That way.
Uh-oh,
We're gonna get there eventually.
we might get there. It's a team effort.
Can
Bingo.
you still see it on Zoom?
Yeah.
Perfect. We're gonna go with that.
Great. Well, thanks. Thanks for being here again. Thank you, Tori.
I don't know.
Y'all would have seen it, but nobody out there would have seen it. So I'm going to represent a set of co-authors here. Justin Benavides, my colleague, who's also in the room. Pete Teal is one of our colleagues at Texas A&M who has spent a career on ticks and the diseases of ticks. So he's in our Department of Entomology. Natalie Graff's one of our PhD students. So our talk here is going to be a little bit about cattle fever ticks. I want to hit about three things, a little bit about the ticks, some analysis we're working on, and then a set of future work that we have in the works right now on a variety of issues around fever ticks and their continued sort of monitoring, and I ought to say continued eradication, because while we might have them eradicated for most of us, we don't have them all the way eradicated. So let me say a little bit about fever ticks. Anybody familiar with cattle fever ticks? Cattle fever ticks, if you're not, is a particular type of tick. There's two, Rhipicephalus annulatus and microplus. It's a sole host tick. They carry babesia, which is a disease of cattle, similar to malaria, you might say in people. There's a people version of babesia also, but babesia in a naive cattle population, when that disease happens, you have mortality up to 90% of your herd. So the ticks were introduced, we think, by the Spaniards when they came in the 1500s. Their native range is essentially the entire South. Basically, if you looked at a map, Interstate 35, East Texas, to the Tennessee-Kentucky border, Virginia border, really defined by climate. Defined by they're not going to survive where it's colder. The other part or area, they also don't make it where it's really hot and dry. So it's just a portion of far south Texas. And if we look at their historic range, Southern California, where we are here, is also part of their historic range. And so, in fact, if we went back to the old, anybody seen old Western movies with cattle drives? One of the things that happened was they would drive Texas cattle north. And when the cattle went through areas like in Missouri and Oklahoma, after the Texas cattle went through, a couple of weeks later, all the local cattle would die. And so they talked about a Texas cattle fever. And so what they did was they banned, they didn't want any of those Texas cattle coming through. So that as you look at historically, as the cattle drives, we went through time, the cattle drives were further west. Different trails that took animals away from those populated areas where we had naive population of cattle. So in the early 1900s, we had an effort to eradicate the ticks. If you get rid of the ticks, you don't get the disease. Nothing else carries that. And so an eradication program was done that took about 60 years to do, eradicated them throughout the South and pushed them all the way down to the Rio Grande River. And in fact, just like the bottom three counties is the quarantine zone because they don't make it further west. The ticks don't live. So if you look at today, we have a quarantine zone. We have folks that ride the border who look for stray animals, for animals that come across the river, animals that come across. In fact, even those that we import cattle from Mexico, and we import more than 1 million head feeder cattle a year, all cattle that come in are inspected and dipped for ticks. And dipped is exactly what it sounds like. There's a big vat and they run the cattle through one at a time and they jump in and they have to swim through the vat and then climb out the other side. And so it's a complete immersion, submersion in a kerosene. So all cattle that come in have to be dipped. So we have this continued monitoring. Well, what happens is we continue to find ticks in far south Texas. We continue to have some outbreaks further north. And so it's an ongoing process, sort of like, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so what we really don't want is the ticks getting back to their historic range throughout the South. And so we have a program, a joint USDA, APHIS, and Texas Animal Health Commission program that monitors for ticks. When we find them, there's a procedure in place to eradicate them from the property, to inspect the animals, and a plan is developed for each property that fits the country that it is, the type of animals that are there, and fine-tunes that eradication program to the ranch itself. So that's a little bit of background on that. let me tell you kind of where we've gone with this analysis. We have both a ranch level, a model that's a simulation model. And when I say simulation model, what Justin built, I want to give him full credit for this. We have a simulation model that takes the life cycle of the cattle in the seasonality of the climate, rainfall, temperature that they live in. We have the simulation model of the life cycle of the tick, because the ticks get on the animal, they feed, they drop off, they lay eggs, and this continues to go on. And incorporated in that also is cattle, livestock, and environment interaction with wildlife, with deer. In South Texas, particularly, anybody heard of a nilgai? A nilgai is a big old antelope that originated in India. They were imported to the US in the 1920s for hunting. It's about the size of an elk, but has two spike horns. Like I said, they originated in India. There's some thinking that if you think about, as I said, the Spaniards introduced the tick when they brought cattle over. The ticks were endemic to the Mediterranean rim of countries and across to India. So when we inadvertently, when those nilgai were brought over, which are natives of India, we brought over another host for the ticks. The ticks prefer cattle. That's their preferred happy place or meal plan or however you want to do it. But they like the nilgai, okay. And they will hang around with a white-tailed deer. But cattle are their preferred host, which gives you an idea of how you control them in that what you do is if you can inspect all the cattle on a property, round them up, present them for inspection, dip them on the property, dip them when they leave, you can eradicate the tick because they really only want to live on the cattle, right? So that gives you a way to actually control them. That's been the strategy forever. Since this was started. What I should say about that, if we look at the regulations, the basic idea is if your property's found with these ticks, the basic plan is you as the rancher are required to round up and present your cattle for inspection and dipping every 14 days. So think about that process every 2 weeks. Depending on the time of year that this happens, you're going to do that for 6 months or 9 months. So every 2 weeks for 9 months, you're going to round up all your cattle and get them to a place through your pens where they're going to be inspected and dipped by either APHIS or Texas Animal Health Commission. The agencies really work together to make this work. That's a pretty big undertaking. And in fact, if you don't, it can be that sometimes you'll be under quarantine. There are properties that are under quarantine for years. There was an outbreak on the King Ranch in the 1970s, and they were quarantined for 7 years. It took them 7 years to eliminate the ticks. And if you think about it, they drop off, they're in the brush. The type of grasslands, brush, mesquite, the country that they're in allows them to, can allow them to survive. And again, this wildlife interaction going on as well. So I want to show you one part of our model, some results where we're looking at. So I should say too, we looked at a plan for 14 days. That is with a particular caricide called Cumafos. There's another one, Dectomax. Lots of us are a lot more familiar with that than used to be, right? But you think about Dectomax, which is every 28 days. So instead of presenting every 14 days, you're presenting the cattle every 28 days for treatment. There's a number of other technologies that folks are working on, including a vaccine. You might think about vaccines working on, not on stuff like ticks, right? Well, it turns out there is some vaccine work that does affect the ticks. And so vaccines would be a shot you might get every year with a booster. So there's a work on a bunch of different technologies. So I want to show one part of this work. And what we have here is those two columns are a 14-day treatment interval for 6 months and 9 months, a 28-day interval on a 100-cow ranch. We're going to compare that 28-day to the 14-day and kind of the percent change in cost. We have two sets of costs. The ranch cost, well, I should also point out we got a 200-cow ranch and a 300-cow ranch, 300-cow ranch. And then those bottom set of rows deal with agency costs. So if you think about it, agencies have something they got to do. They've got to be able to invest in the infrastructure infrastructure to be able to treat the ticks. Not everywhere has a dipping vat on the property. Nobody has that anymore. But there are mobile vats. There are what they call spray boxes on a trailer. You run the animal through, they got nozzles everywhere and it sprays the animal and the animal runs on out. So we have a set of agency costs that include capital fixed expenses and a set of variable costs. The things I would point out is if we look at just that 14-day interval, an outbreak, and I should also say we base this work with the agencies on an outbreak called the live oak outbreak. That's where the outbreak occurred, and it occurred through an auction market. So think about cattle auction markets. So cattle go through, they found a tick there. Where did all the cattle go that went through that property that had interaction with those other steers or heifers or whatever? They went everywhere. And so interesting thing about our costs is it includes trace out. The cost to the agencies of going and tracking where those animals went to whatever property they went to. So we'll just take that 9-month, 14-day interval. I'll focus on the agency costs. It takes about $1.6 million to put the infrastructure together, the capital expenses to deal with an outbreak. Another $1.5 million in variable costs. That's the labor, the driving around, the chemicals, everything else. For a total of $3.1 million dealing with an outbreak of that size of outbreak. Certainly you see, the longer the interval, certainly much lower variable costs. Going out every 2 weeks, you're going out every 4 weeks. But I think this highlights kind of where we're going in terms of ranch costs. And I think that really highlights the risk to properties and the reason we want to keep the ticks from spreading. Because if you think about how many cattle are in Texas, eastern Oklahoma, and the rest of the South, it's a huge portion of the total cow herd of the U.S. And so think about the costs of dealing with this on a ranch, particularly, and I should say too, this does not include getting the disease, right? In a naive population, it kills 90% of your cows. So we really don't want this. And for trade purposes, Babesia is a reportable disease to OIE. And so it's not something you really want to have. And we've been fortunate that we have not had any outbreaks of disease, but we find the ticks. The deal is if you control the ticks, you control the disease. It's a one host species. So where we're going with this work, we've been asked to look at and develop sort of a benefit cost of the program. The idea that an ounce of prevention, can we maintain the quarantine zone to prevent the outbreak so we don't have to re-eradicate or have the whole industry take those losses, those disease losses? The idea of the cost and risk of expansion. There's some interesting work by some modelers that look at climate change as we get warmer temperatures higher. The historic range of the tick expands. Some of that work would get into Colorado and Kansas, where the winters, where the temperature will allow the ticks to expand their old historic range. So we're kind of looking at that as well. I think it has some applications as an agency planning model where they can plan for some outbreaks and their costs that they have to deal with it. The interesting thing about that is we modeled both the Texas Animal Health Commission and AVIS expenditures together because the agencies do work together. It really is a team among them. And so they help each other out when they have budget needs. They do the work together. They take different parts of different roles. So we did model them together. I think particularly one of the more interesting areas is in the wildlife interaction. Because if they can hang on a deer for a while and stay alive and not get treated by the acaricide, then it extends the time period you're going to be in treatment, the time period you're going to be in quarantine, because the ticks keep coming back. So one of the old time treatments was that if you wanted to get rid of the ticks, you got rid of all the cattle on the pasture because ticks can't live without cattle. But as we got more deer, they would vacate pastures for years. You'd come back and you'd still find the ticks because they were living on the deer. And for a variety of reasons, but one is long-term screwworm eradication, we have huge white-tailed deer populations. And we have the development of hunting ranches where we breed deer for recreation, for hunting purposes. So we got a lot more wildlife out there than we used to. So with that, that is my last slide. So that's sort of where we're going with cattle fever tick stuff. In a variety of areas. Anybody got any questions? Oh, dang. There is a question.
This is slightly off base. Do you know for that particular outbreak, they were able to take advantage of farm service agencies or lab where they offset some of the costs?
Oh, good question. So were ranchers able to take advantage of ELAP to offset some of the costs of treatment? At that time, they were not. But since then, they have been able to. And so they have been able to use some funding from that to offset some of the costs, because we do find these a lot. You know, that brings up, there's a National Wildlife Refuge that is a big problem in eradicating the ticks. It's in far South Texas. And the ticks are there, the nilgai are there, the white-tailed deer are there, and you got a whole lot of different set of rules with a National Wildlife Refuge. And so that's become a real problem in trying to eliminate the ticks, because you can't do everything you'd like to do in that wildlife refuge. But ELAP's been an area where they have been able to do that since then. Great question. Couple more. Yes, ma'am.
So in other countries, there's actually the vaccine against babesia itself, not yet in the US. Have you looked into that and using it with the tick control as well?
Yeah, so the question is the vaccine about for babesia that's used in other countries. So there is some work on these vaccines, and there's a couple of different versions that actually kill the ticks. And the interesting about that is the efficacy of the vaccines. It works better on one of those critters than the other. They have about an 86% efficacy on one. The other, I can't remember if it's annulatus or microplus. The other one is about 56%. So your vaccine really isn't very good depending on what type of those two in the same family you have. So there's, I'd probably argue there's been some mixed results, but there's a bunch of work going on different vaccines. But, the acaricides are 99 point whatever percent effective. And which should bring the idea, if we're working on eradication and you use acaricides indiscriminately, you do get resistance. And resistance is a big issue on the acaricides that we're using. And where that problem comes in is particularly in Mexico, where they've been used indiscriminately. I guess let's not be too harsh. That's a mess. Yes, sir. Okay. Oh, fantastic. ESP or something. Yes.
Producers generally willing to, I guess they would have to be willing to like when they have a tick, or they generally reporting it and getting the help they need?
Generally, I would say, yeah, they generally do. Even though it's a pretty big pain, do some get, if you thought you had it, you got a big incentive to, well, I think I'll just sell those suckers before anybody knows. Does that happen? Oh, heck yeah, no doubt. And you got to know what the thing looks like. You got to be able to find it. And, people aren't necessarily looking for those. The other thing is during deer hunting season, you go through checkpoints. You're supposed to keep the hide on there so that they can be inspected. They do have fever tick checkpoints for that, to make sure we're not hauling them on a deer to wherever else. Good question. We got time for more, Tori? You keep me on time? Okay, we'll take a couple more. Yes.
I was just wondering if there's with one specific disease of why you're doing these tick checks, going to be checking for other ticks checked for as well, and you're going out there to be able to.
We got a bunch of different kinds of ticks, and ticks bring a whole lot of different problems to cattle production. This is a pretty bad disease. The rest of it is.
I didn't know it's like animal.
So that's where I was going. Well, I was thinking anaplasmosis. We do have outbreaks of that to the extent they're hauled by ticks. There are regions of the state that are more, so where we have more problems with that than others. I'd probably say, in some of these diseases like anaplasmosis and stuff, there's not a lot of work on it. There's even less on kind of some economic stuff. I've been doing some work with one of my extension vet colleague on some fairly simple benefit cost stuff of treatment of anaplasmosis and some other diseases.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's a way, not knowing. Overlap it, reduce the cost by combining.
Yeah, it's true too that some places where we have anaplasmosis, we don't have these ticks because it's too cold for them in the winter. And so it's not a perfect overlap around them. Good question.
One more.
Yes.
Question, I was wondering if, I just imagine the costs of quarantine, especially as we get into weeks and years, months and years. Put an operation out of business.
Well, certainly the biggest problem is that what's the cost of rounding up and presenting them all the time? Even though you may be to the point where you're not, you're doing it yourself. So certainly the opportunity cost of your time is a big deal.
Yeah.
And it's, I think that's a good point. I think that's why we don't want this thing to go back to where it was before.
I mean, I think regionally, probably larger in Texas, I would think, larger.
You can get to numbers with this of $250 per cow per year in actual cost of what it's costing you to round up every couple of weeks and bring them over to the pens and have them do, $250 a cow is a lot of money. I mean, that's a large percent change in sort of costs. So you spread that across the whole South, you're going to take a lot of areas that will no longer be economic for production. Potentially that's a really big impact in cattle production.
It's still a variable cost, it's not a fixed cost. So,
Mhm.
The smaller operation, the smaller the cost. But I was thinking that, maybe there's a small size, a threshold size where it doesn't make any sense to stay in business.
It could very well be the case.
You might, in a larger operation, you might be able to stay in business by quarantining maybe part of the herd or something like that.
I think you can quarantine, particularly if so you'll have places that are under quarantine because they found the ticks there and are going to go through this. You have adjacent properties that you're going to have that they're going to be inspected, and you dip everything in there once and maybe inspect again later. And then there are other properties that some animal may have been shipped there, and so you check those. So it is possible, and if the ranch was big enough to maybe quarantine part of it or certain pastures. So I think there's a host of those kinds of things available. You got one more? Go ahead.
Do you have an estimate on how many ranches or operations or cattle are in a quarantine at one time?
There is some data on that the cattle fever tick program has. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you. And it does change with kind of seasonality of things. And as they clear properties, sometimes you get a new one. And so there's a seasonality of outbreaks. Good question.
You are going to stay a little bit around after.
Yeah, I'll be hanging
Anybody
around.
else has any questions, he will stick around a little bit after.
Well, thanks.
I think we're good. I'm not in. Let's listen.
If I touch you, something's liable to bad to happen.
Who's next?
I am Tom, and then you will be.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Let's see here. Can I close out of here? Okay.
You'll be introduced. You can use yourself.
You want to do? I can.
You can use
Okay. That's. Can you tell we're just kind of go flying by the seat of our pants here? All right. Let's see. Tom, Lee, can y'all see that?
Yep, I can see
Got it.
You might make sure you're sharing the right screen. I think David's, I just seen not the presentation file.
Are you talking about the presenter view?
Yeah, presenter view.
So
There
we're
you
having
go.
to show y'all the presenter view so the audience here can see the actual slideshow view.
No worries then, sounds good.
Sorry, guys, on Zoom. We're doing the best we can here.
Gotcha.
So I am Claire Marshall. I currently work at University of Tennessee with their extension, but I'm also currently finishing up my PhD at Oklahoma State University, and that's where this research is coming from today. So when we put this track session together, we had kind of a different topic in view of where we were going to go, but we kind of had to shift gears pretty quickly due to some data, but we will talk about that research later on as far as what we were wanting to talk about. But today's topic is biosecurity knowledge and implementation among Oklahoma stocker producers. And so this is not nationwide. This is very specific to Oklahoma, but a lot of this information probably can vary across states with their stocker programs. So to kind of give you this outline for Oklahoma, our cattle industry is very strong and it's very prominent in the state. We still rank in the top 5 states based on all cattle and calves inventory in the United States. And so when we think about beef cattle production, there's 3 sectors to it. Cow calf, that's where we have producers who have a permanent herd and their goal is to sell calves later on. Now, depending on when they sell those calves is kind of where we look at our 2 next sectors, stocker, feedlot. And what we're going to focus our topic on today is stocker cattle. And for those that really don't know or don't have a specific definition as to what stocker cattle are, is they're calves or cattle that have been weaned around that 450, some a little bit less, give or take, to that 600-pound mark. And then they're placed on grass or a growing ration to get them to that 700 to 850 pounds, which then leads them to being able to enter into a feedlot or the feedlot sector. A lot of times, and I've heard it many times when we're talking about stocker cattle, the goal of stocker producers is to buy them ugly and sell them pretty. I've heard that many times that that's the goal of stocker producers. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean talking about their physical characteristics, but they may also talk about their health characteristics of how these stocker producers are buying these cattle. Sometimes they're not always the healthiest or prettiest in that situation, but their goal is to, and their main goal when they purchase these cattle, the value that they're trying to add on to them is that weight gain. That's their goal when they're selling them later on, is that additional weight. So when we think about stocker production versus cow-calf producers, we're having to look, and our mindset is having to be different depending on which sector we're thinking about. Cow-calf producers, they're looking at long-term investments. They have that permanent herd where their goal is to sell calves. They're going to have that breeding in their operation. Whereas if we're looking at just stocker producers, those calves that are coming onto their operation at most could be there typically 8 months. Those calves could be there as short as 2 months. So it's a shorter term investment for those producers versus those cow-calf producers that have that long-term asset, that long-term investment in this operation. And stocker producers are a very prominent enterprise, but even though they're prominent, we still don't have a lot of information on them and don't know a lot about their practices and how they work, because this operation is so flexible for these producers. They can be really anywhere within the United States. They're stocker producers pretty much across the US. They're prominent in some states more than others. But then the other thing with it is the flexibility to be considered a stocker producer. And what I mean by that is you don't just have to be a cow-calf producer or a stocker producer. And we've got here, you can be a cow-calf producer where the cow-calf is your primary enterprise, but you may decide to, instead of selling those calves right when they're weaned, retain that ownership, get them to that 700-pound mark, and then sell them straight into a feedlot. Or your primary enterprise may be those stocker calves, as we said, buying those bargain cattle, those buy them ugly, sell them pretty. That may be your primary operation, and you have no long-term investment in a permanent cow-calf herd. So knowing these differences, knowing the flexibility around these 2 different types of operations, our goal and the 2 really burning questions that we had, and I say we had to shift topics, but we come up with these questions, given what we could look at, is one is, okay, if we know that we have these two types of primary enterprises, what are some differences? Is there differences in the people that are running these two types of operations, or are they basically the same and it just depends on their preference of the type of cattle that they're wanting to produce? And then the second question that we have, and really what the goal of today's topic is about, is this second question. So within stocker producers, and this is within stocker producers in Oklahoma, this is specifically for Oklahoma, not across the US, are there different management practices pertaining to animal health? So to stocker producers, as we've said, they're buying them ugly, selling them pretty, their health may not be as great. Do they have a different perception of how they're handling these cattle based on that fact? So where we got our data from, what we're looking at is this survey data. So these are two separate surveys that we look at to compare the cow-calf producers to the stocker producers. And the first one is this Oklahoma Beef Management and Marketing Survey. So this was designed by OSU Extension, Dr. Kelly Raper and Dr. Darrell Peel. They were on this and they implemented this in the years 2008, 17, and 2022 in order to track those changes in beef cattle management. And we were able to capture those demographics of these cow-calf producers. The second one that we use, and what we're really going to look at its data from today, is this 2017 Oklahoma Stocker Movement Survey. So this one was actually developed jointly by not only OSU, but also USDA APHIS, they were able to do this, and it was designed in order to help with the spatial disease spread models. So when this was administered by NASS, the beef marketing management one had a 29.9% response rate and then a 31% response rate in Oklahoma. So could have seen some higher numbers, but also happy with what we were able to get with this respondent rate. So the first thing, as we looked at, this is going to answer our first question of the differences between those cow-calf producers and those primary stocker producers. And we see some typical things. The most common age, it was the same between producers. The education, typical stocker producers had a bachelor's degree, while primary cow-calf producers, their highest degree was high school degree. But what I really want to point out here is there's two things. And the first one is top 3 reasons to be in the cattle business. So the first two, cattle producers, it's a lifestyle for cattle producers. That's their number one, and it's also a family tradition. But the third reason changed. So for cow-calf producers, it was their secondary source of income. For stocker producers, it was their primary income. So that's kind of setting the mood of how serious they're taking these practices and these operations based on these stocker producers that are doing these short-term investment in these bargain cattle per se. They've got to make sure that they're getting a value out of them because this is their primary income for them. Where cow-calf producers, yes, they want to sell the best calf possible that they can, but it's not their main source of income for their family and their household. The second thing that I really wanted to point out here was this portion of respondents that completed beef quality assurance or master cattleman training in Oklahoma. So for the cow-calf, 9% completed beef quality assurance. For stockers, 24% completed the beef quality assurance. And what this is and why this is important to talk about when we're talking about animal health and management practices is that typically both of these programs, if you've never really sat through them, what they do, and one of the goals of them is to proper health management practices, is producers are educated in both of those programs about that. So that's interesting that we have these stocker producers completing more of this beef quality assurance than we do cow-calf producers. So now moving into this within stocker producers. Like I said, this was our main topic. This is what we wanted to talk about today, was this within stocker producers question. Do we see differences within those Oklahoma stocker producers? So now this is disease occurrences for these operations. And what we have here, the first thing is the average morbidity rate and the average mortality rate. So morbidity rate is just a specific illness or condition that these cattle have. They may get sick. This could be they have pink eye. They could have some type of respiratory illness. This is those occurrences. So for all Oklahoma stocker operations that completed this survey, they had a 12% average morbidity rate. Whereas the average mortality rate occurring was 2.6% was occurring for these stocker producers. These producers reported that the most commonly occurring disease causing sickness, bovine respiratory disease, which is can be an upper or lower respiratory tract, can have a lot of economic losses associated with this. So this is very serious if they do have cattle that have this condition. And they reported 38% reported that BRD illness was frequent. 34% reported that BRD illness sometimes was frequent in their operations. And one of the big things that may cause this respiratory disease is stress. So when we think about these calves, they're completely changing their environment. We just said that they've just been weaned. Some of them are literally weaned by getting on the trailer and sold at the market is how they've been weaned. So you think about the environment they're in, they are stressed. So it's not unusual that there may be contracting this, given the change in their environment, change in feed, that they're seeing this. Then these stocker producers also reported that the most common cause of death due to illness is BRD again. So with that being said, this disease was reported as the largest threat for these stocker producers. These producers ranked BRD as being the largest threat for their operations. Diseases that were considered medium threat or rarely seen across all these operations was pink eye bloat, coccidiosis, and then diseases such as Johne's or foreign animal diseases such as FMD, foot and mouth disease. Those were considered low threat for these. So this is how they perceive these threats for their operation, the likelihood of their cattle contracting any of these diseases or illnesses. So now that we know this of their perceptions about these, the threats that could be coming onto their operations, now we look at their management practices, knowing how they perceive these threats. So what we did for this survey is use a Likert scale. So for this one is always, so that means that they would always treat or always vaccinate their cattle, for instance, for killed respiratory vaccines. 5 is never, meaning they would never treat for external parasites if that rank is 5. So we have from least frequently used to most frequently used. So what we found interesting in this is that the clostridial vaccines, they ranked this as, or they said, almost always or frequently they vaccinated for clostridial diseases. Now, if we remember and we think about this, they said that clostridial diseases was a low threat to them. So why are they almost always vaccinating or treating for these if it's a low threat? Well, the answer to that is we don't know. We don't know why that is. Is it because they consider it a low threat because they always vaccinate for it? Or is there a misconstrued perception between what they feel is a threat versus what they actually vaccinate for? This is just how they've typically done it. So we're not really for sure why they say it's a low threat, but then they almost always vaccinate for it. So that's a question that's been raised to us and something that we don't know unless we sit down and talk to the producers as to why this is how they operate on their farms. So preventative practices. This is using winter fly tags all the way to summer deworming. Metaphylaxis, what that is it's just an all-inclusive health management practice. When a calf comes onto the operation, they're vaccinated, they're dewormed, everything is done, even if they're the golden child of that herd that they brought in, that set of calves that they brought in. What I find, and really when I was sitting here thinking, okay, winter deworming, summer deworming, they are always going to do that. And I was thinking, why would they do that? Why do we see that? Well, our goal with these cattle is that weight gain. They want to make sure they're added weight to them. So they're going to deworm them always to make sure that there's nothing stopping them or postponing that ability to be able to add that weight to these calves in order to get them out and sold them to feedlots. So that kind of is what we're expecting with this. And then there's something else that we had an opportunity to look at that we also find really interesting, and it's within these stocker producers in Oklahoma, we then were able to break it down one step further to stalker types and their health management differences. So we were able to ask them the question, or I wasn't in on this survey when they did it, so I should say they were able to ask them this question, but they were able to place themselves in one of four different types. Type 1 being the least likely to place importance on cattle attributes, so what their health status was, what they look like, their geographic origin, and their certified preconditioning status. So these would be the ones that we would probably call the risk takers. These are the ones that are looking for those bargain cattle. They don't look real good in that lot, but they're going to buy them and they're going to make them the best thing ever. That's what these producers are looking at. Then we've got the one that is, we would say, most risk averse, probably is this most likely is type 3, most likely to place importance on cattle attributes, geographic origin, and certified preconditioning. Those are the ones that they're going to still say they're stalker producers. We're going to do this, but they're not going to take that chance of having several calves on them die from things, from health concerns, from sickness and everything. They're going to put the most weight on, okay, what have they been through? Where have they come from before I go and buy these? And the reason we have type 3 up here and instead of type 4, you think one would be most risk averse or most risk taking and most risk averse. Type 4 is, yes, they place a high importance on the attributes and the distance from their farm, but they don't really care about where they're coming from or that certified preconditioning. And what that certified preconditioning is, for the survey was the Oklahoma Quality Beef Network, that they went through this, that they're certified, they had these set vaccines and everything. So when they were looking at this from a security or biosecurity standpoint, that would be for them the most risk averse, or not as risk averse because they didn't care as much about that preconditioning. So that's kind of why I didn't go from 1 to 4 on that. So now looking at this, based on these stalker types, we broke out different diseases and the morbidity frequency. So this was just that they contracted this illness. And so what we find here is that we've got it broken out by types 1 through 4, and then BRD, those clostridial diseases such as blackleg, coccidiosis, bloat, and pink eye. And now that we think about this, we got to shift gears with me here for a second. Earlier, we wanted to see 1 because that was frequently. Now we want to see 4. The higher, the better is what we want to see now, because now this is talking about frequency of diseases on these operations. So shift gears and kind of, I know I'm having to pull and move things here, but shift gears for me. So the higher the number, the better we are now. So what we have here, and what's interesting is that, remember, type 1 are, I don't care what I get, just as long as I get some calves to add some weight to and sell later on. Those were our, we'll say, risk loving. And then type 3 was ours, no, I want to know what I'm getting, what's coming onto my farm. So what we find here is that there's not much difference between the morbidity frequency of these two. Even though these type 1s could be bringing in whatever, yes, they still might be. So for instance, clostridial, they're both, they see the frequency of that disease the same. Whereas type 3 actually sees more BRD, bovine respiratory disease, than type 1 does. So some of them make sense. You would expect that BRD, you would see more of that in those less healthy calves, whereas it's kind of interesting that they see just as much for pink eye. Those type 1 see just as much pink eye as type 3 does. And so the question is, why? And again, we don't know unless we sit down with these producers. But one of the questions that we posed is, are those type 3, those primary stalker producers, the ones that this is their livelihood and they're bringing in more cattle, they're moving them through quicker, whereas the type 1s are those that are bringing in maybe their cow-calf producers that get a stalker group every now and then. They're the ones, so yes, they're going to see a little bit more. So that's kind of where we're looking at that and pose that question of where do we fall now and how do we answer this, that those that are more risk takers have just as much frequency as those that are risk averse. So now we look at mortality frequency. So this is death caused by this illness. So death caused by BRD, death caused by a clostridial disease. And what we find here, the only one that type 3, those more risk averse producers, the only one that they saw less frequent deaths by than any other type of stocker producer was in pink eye. They were the only one. Every other disease, they saw more deaths than the other types of producers. And so again, we asked that question, are they seeing more deaths? Because those are our primary stocker producers and they're having more calves run through than the other types are. And so that's where we're falling into this question, and that we're seeing that we've gotten a lot of answers from this survey, but we still haven't answered all the questions, and we're still learning, and we still have a long ways to go on understanding how these stocker producers are operating and getting more into what type of stocker producers do we have in Oklahoma. And then morbidity and mortality occurrences by stocker type. Type 1, we get what we expect. They have more morbidity occurrences and they have more mortality occurrences. So that's what we expect to see. These are the more risk taking. They have more deaths than any other type of producer. So in conclusion, what we learned is we learned a lot, but then we also created more questions for ourselves, which gives us job security, I guess we can say, because it created more questions for us. But there's a lot of different risk assessments. There's a lot of different risk perceptions when it comes to stocker producers, but just because there's these different management practices, it doesn't necessarily define the morbidity or the mortality rates on these operations. However, it can dictate the overall health problems we see. Those that are more risk-taking, they're going to see more morbidity frequency. They're going to see more mortality across the entire board than any other type of producer. And then finally, this is kind of where we wanted to go, but where we are this survey is currently the data is currently being analyzed, and we were not able to get our hands on it yet. We did partner with an agency, and they're currently working on getting this cleaned up for us to look at. This is really what we wanted to talk about today, but I still think we posed a really good question and was able to have a discussion on the animal health management practices of stocker producers. But what we wanted to look at, we've actually sent a very specific survey that hopefully will answer a lot of the questions that was created by what we looked at today in this biosecurity survey for Oklahoma cattle producers. And so that's actually going to get into the nitty-gritty of telling us why we went the direction we did, why they see more frequency of these certain illnesses. And then what we want to look at is, do different sectors differ in how they prepare for animal health disasters? Are feedlots going to be more prepared for an animal health disaster versus a cow-calf producer? Are they going to be more prepared for one locally? Is a cow-calf producer going to be as prepared for an international, let's say, foot and mouth disease outbreak? Are they going to be more prepared than a feedlot if that occurred, given the gravity of the situation, if that outbreak came into our domestic grounds? And then the other question is, do actions and preparedness influence the perception of the U.S. ability to recover? So if they don't believe that the U.S., if a foot and mouth disease occurred here in the United States, if their perception is that the United States could not handle it, that we couldn't get it under wraps, under our belt, are their actions and health management practices, do they match that perception that they believe? Can they actually, or is it, no, we're good, they can handle it, we're not going to worry about our management practices here on the farm? So with that, I'll take any questions. Are we good on time, David?
I forgot to look.
Okay, well, that's good. No worries.
To be honest. Let's take a question.
I have a question. Do y'all have any discussion about number of doses and appropriate application of vaccines, right?
Yes, and I don't think they did that in this specific piece surveys. I do think that maybe in the biosecurity survey where they say, did they do full vaccine treatments and such? I think that will be what's coming up in the 2021 surveys.
One thing we've just kind of anecdotally seen, riding around with our cattle specialists, is that there's a lot of one dose options for Clostridials. There's not really any one dose options that don't require boosters if you're doing it appropriately for BRB.
Yeah.
And so some of our producers like, well, I'm not gonna round them up for a second dose, so I'm not gonna give them the first one in the first place because the efficacy is so low. But then there's some who say, yeah, I'll give them the first dose and I'm not around for the second. So I'm just curious if that has something to do with, you know, ease of use.
And it could very well be, and that could be one, I don't know, I do think the biosecurity survey is gonna have some questions, is do you follow through with the vaccine protocols that are listed? Or are you one dose, but you really needed 2 doses, but you think one will be good enough, let's go. Yeah, I think there will be, I do hope that that is in the survey, you know, that we're at that, so then we can see. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Just a quick question, you suspect, and when you ask the feed buyers, right? It's not.
Mhm.
You suspect a difference in their requirements, say risk takers selling to same, you know, a certain kind of feedlot buyer versus you know, more risk averse stocker that would sell to, you know, a different set of feedlot buyers.
So yes, making sure that I'm understanding your question. Do we think that we would see the same type of, you've got feedlot buyers that are gonna buy those riskier cattle, and then you've got some feedlot buyers that are buying the more, they're more risk averse, that's fine. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, are they generally, you know, segmented that way?
I would say that we didn't ask that, so I don't have a specific answer to that, but I think that you're always gonna have feedlot buyers that will buy some riskier cattle, but they also know that if they buy some risky cows, they also know that they need to offset it with some that they're gonna guarantee once they're at a feedlot, they're gonna make it. So those feedlot buyers know what they're purchasing, they have it, they are in that game of where if I buy a risky set of calves and this risky lot of calves, I need to offset it with some that are going to make it once they get to the feedlot, yes. So I think they still in some way, maybe a little bit different, but I still think they play kind of that same game of what type of cattle am I buying today? Absolutely. Any other questions?
Great, thanks.
Let's see. All right, Tom, you should be able to share your screen.
Cool.
Yep, we're good. Oops, sorry, Jamie.
Take it away, Tom.
Sorry, I had to unmute.
That's what I figured. It's all yours.
Okay. So I'm talking about shifting gears a little bit, talking about the global burden of animal disease program, and specifically focus on some economic metrics and measurements. But before I do that, this is work by myself, Dustin Pindell, and a number of other people on the team. I want to motivate why we're interested in global burden of animal diseases, or we call it GBADs. And I want to give this as more of a global perspective, and we're going to focus on farm animals and aquaculture, and with apologies to pets and wildlife. Talk a couple case studies, and then come back and wrap back around to biosecurity and mostly investment. So globally, there's a lot of challenges when you think about measuring a global burden of disease, whether it's humans or animals. You have to think about your population data, your input expenditure, disease data. We have all types of species. We also have all types of diseases. And so, you know, what are the challenges here, and how do we handle them? There's complexities here, multiple production systems. Typically, prioritization focuses around what's notifiable, and you know, and that directly affects trade, zoonosis and foodborne, and what's notifiable. That's more or less ad hoc. It really doesn't give us direction. In some instances, this has worked well, but if you ask the question, are we optimally using resources to deal with the burden of animal disease? The answer is probably no. So what we're trying to do is think about of a systematic way to do a burden of disease estimate, and then how that is used to develop strategies of investment in capacities of animal health systems. What we're thinking about is to apply an economic approach where you understand the context, identify the weakness in resource allocation, understand why it is weak, and then reallocate resources. As opposed to a disease becomes important, a strategy is developed, and then economic justification comes on later, and then here's your program. So the latter one is really adding value through advocacy of an interest group, and that's not all bad, but that certainly is not searching for optimality across economic agents. What I really want to focus on the program here is that GBADS provides metrics and methods to guide investment, including biosecurity and resource allocation, but we have to define some metrics to do so. And I think it's good to compare human health versus animal health and the mortality and morbidity related to it and what measurements and metrics are used. For morbidity, often you can think about the disability adjusted life years, the DALYs. There's variations off this. Mortality, we often use the value of statistical life in economics, but the critical difference between, say, DALYs and humans and animals is that the animal lifespan on a farm is often set by market forces. So it's really difficult to apply a disability adjusted life years to a farmed animal. In animal health, we can think about mortality and capture that value using asset value or capital value. And Jarvis has a very nice paper in 1974. In morbidity, what we're working on, and this is where part of GBADS comes in, is the focus on productivity changes. And so what do I mean by that? So just in a nutshell here, this is really a production technology. It's the potential production function, that's F of Z. And then I adjust it by a loss function or damage function, L, which goes between 0 and 1. And that loss function is impacted by the disease, endowment B0, and the control C of X. So effectively, this is what we're thinking in terms of a productivity burden as a start of a measure of the burden of animal disease. And also what we also need to capture is expenditure on controls as well as the burden of the lost output. So this isn't new. This was used in crop production. So you can look at crop loss as well. This loss function runs between 0 and 1. And what the objective is to do is to measure the total burden across all diseases first, and then second, to attribute out these to infectious, non-infectious disease and other issues. In that way, you're not tempted to overcount or double count some of these. There's a lot of challenges that remain here. I'm going to move on beyond this just for time's sakes. So here's kind of the overall structure. We have scientists working on developing livestock population estimates, their biomass and value. And unlike human populations, these are often they're either unknown or often uncertain in many parts of the world. Then we're going to calculate this productivity change with this animal health loss envelope. You know, how much are we losing? How much are we spending? And this you can really think about as production efficiency. Then attribute these out to health problems and accidents. And then at the end of the day, we want to look at the impact across the economy. And why is this important? We want to know who is burdened and by how much, and that can help us think more about allocative efficiency and equity at the end of the day, and reinvestment. So learning from human diseases, you can think about packaging all of these into square and say each one of the sides goes from 0 to 1, and then look at the overall impact at the global level, national level, or say at a city level. And this would be examples of what they do with the global burden of disease for humans, and something we're striving towards with the global burden of animal diseases. As well as break them apart, as I mentioned earlier, maybe something like notifiable diseases, endemic diseases, and those effects from nutrition and water at the global, national, and say sectoral level. Okay, so what we try to capture here is the loss in production, the expenditure on control, and then changes in trade in the wider economy. And then if we can translate some of this into, say, producer and consumer surplus, then we can say who is burdened and by how much. And we can break it down to, say, maybe larger commercial growers and small scale producers. So this is just a schematic. In practice, what would you do? You would take those productivity changes, health changes, and you plug them into, say, a partial equilibrium model as exogenous shocks, and you would get outcomes out of that. And as well as you could look at government expenditures and have budgeting to contribute to the total economic impacts. If you were doing a disease event, then you potentially say FMD that maybe affect tourism like it did in the UK, then potentially you could use an input-output model. If the ag sector is a very small part of the total economy, it makes sense to look at partial equilibrium, like say in the US. But if you're in a country like, say, Ethiopia, where agriculture is 40% of GDP, then you would want to look at something like general equilibrium and work through that more macro type of approach. So just turning this all back to biosecurity and investment a little bit. Why is this important? The economic reality is that some countries face severe budget constraints to investment for public goods. And in addition, like market failure, sometimes governments fail. So what GBAD envisions is being able to take some of that information that's generated about impacts on certain economic agents and turn that into measurements of efficiency and equity to guide investments such as biosecurity and infrastructure, maybe regionally by production system or at the country level or globally and over time. And this is kind of the information a lot of your international agencies and nonprofits and governments are looking for. Just a couple of examples. Pendel et al. Looked at hypothetical outbreaks of foot and mouth disease in the US. And what I just want to examine here, using a partial equilibrium model, is what we have here is the outcomes of a FMD outbreak. And the take home I want you to see out of this is I have consumer demand and I have producer surplus, consumer surplus and producer surplus in here. And I have producer surplus broken down by the meat sector, the lamb sector, the egg sector. And so what you can see is different parts of the economy are impacted differently. And this is really important to know if you're thinking about policies or investments or reinvestment plans. If you think about a general equilibrium model, a good example here, Amanda Countryman and Amy Hagerman looked at FMD in Latin America. And what was really interesting that they came out with is they decomposed welfare using the GTAP model into contributions, terms of trade, technology changes, from shocks in production and exports, allocation efficiencies, direct and indirect, how is labor reallocated, and then contributions to savings and investment. And I think the important set of information coming from this type of assessment is that if you can look at savings and investment of countries at a spot in time or over in time, then you can help better target where those investments could be more efficiently. And as Solo said, and Robert Solo said in one of his papers in sustainability in 1993, it's not just about investment to get sustainable growth. It's about efficient investment to get sustainable growth over time. Okay, so that's it. That's what I had to say in a nutshell. And here's some sources. Thank you.
Great, Tom, thanks. Got any questions for Tom? Yeah. You say it and I'll repeat it if that helps. We'll see.
I'm gonna ask on his model with handling productivity of livestock and then being able to separate out human impacts as well. So it wasn't clear to me in the model how the human impacts of productivity loss would be different or separately accounted for versus productivity losses.
Hey, Tom, did you hear that?
No, I didn't. Could you repeat that, please?
I'm not sure I can. Come here. I think that's a good question. I'm not sure I can repeat that.
Hey, Tom, it's Ashley Rayleigh.
Hi, Ashley.
So looking at your model or just the model generally, how are you guys separating out production impacts on consumers and expenditures versus production that would go towards human health? If that. So I'm thinking like, yeah.
Okay, so how do we look at effects? Yes. Okay. Good question. So I didn't really address that much in those slides, but what we are planning to do is there's several directions here, and one of them is to look at the nutrition balance, food nutrition demand and nutrition supply, and then how that affects human health. So if you have a disease event or a change in animal health, how does that affect supply and then interacts with demand for nutrition, and then how that could translate into human health? We are actually working through those logistics right now on that aspect. In terms of zoonotic diseases, the way we're actually handling that is we have team members for the Institute of Health Metrics, and they are actually doing some of the DALY's work, so that when we look at, say, anthrax, then we would know what the impact of anthrax is through a DALY's measure. So right now, that's kind of the two directions or pathways we're thinking of.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Tom? Tom, I think that's it.
All right, thank you all.
Hey, good job. Thanks.